Oh my God. For new volume.
Is that better? That's it. First of all, my name is Alan Armstrong. I'm involved in the Ukrainian Solidarity campaign in Edinburgh and in Scotland. Tonight we're having a launch just hold this book, Ukraine, Voices of Resistance and Solidarity. Our two speakers tonight are, first of all, Chris Ford, who is one of the co-editors of this book, but has also been very involved in Ukrainian solidarity for quite some time. And last year as well, went across the Trade Union delegation to Ukraine. I know that will not be the topic of what he's talking about. If people want some direct information of what life was like in former Russian occupied, we'll be able to give you that. Second speaker is Travis. I've just been trying to get this out. Federico, who is currently living in Edinburgh, working in Glasgow, but is from Ukraine. And we thought it was important to have somebody directly from Ukraine tonight speaking as well. Experience. So that is all I'm going to say just now, and I'm just going to hand over first of all to Chris.
Okay, can you hear okay? Okay, thank you very much everyone for coming, and I hope that you will, of course, buy the book, which is available at the back. So let me start by simply laying out my position before moving on. So in terms of this war, we're approaching the first anniversary, which will be next month on the 24th of February. And my view on this is simply, as at the beginning of the conflict, there is no middle ground in the war. You're either for Ukraine and for a Ukrainian victory, or you're with Putin. There's no nuance in this situation. There's no nuanced position, in fact, more of a nauseous position in my view, if you are not siding with Ukraine. The only conclusion, if you don't support the Ukrainian victory, is that you're for a Russian victory in the conflict. A Russian victory from the beginning would entail the silence of Ukraine, the eradication of Ukraine. It is a war with genocidal intent. The aim of the war started with the removal of any legitimacy of Ukraine's right to exist, and the war has shown that in the territories that are occupied, Ukrainians can't exist as Ukrainians. The aim is either to forcibly evict people, in which they have relocated people forcibly also, to kill them or to Russify them forcibly under the occupation regimes. That has been a pattern in occupied areas of Donbass from 2014. That is a pattern in occupied Crimea. That has been a pattern in the areas of southern Ukraine that remain under occupation. The choice for Ukrainians is whether to exist under a conquest and a neo-colonial reconstituted regime, or to liberate their country entirely. So that's where I say there's no middle ground. We'll touch on some aspects of that. And, first, I want to start then from the purpose of the book, and that is in a situation where one of the voices we don't hear is Ukrainians themselves loud enough. And importantly, a voice that we don't hear is a progressive Ukraine. That's important because one of the things that Putin has set out in this war drive is that he not only are we hearing they want to de-Satanize Ukraine, which as Egyptian warlords are saying, but to denazify Ukraine. And this is a myth that has been perpetuated by the Kremlin for decades. Every representation of the Ukrainian struggle historically is portrayed as reactionary. Every assertion of Ukrainian national rights, of cultural rights, is portrayed as that of a reactionary movement. And Putin has regurgitated all these old narratives from the Tsarist Empire, from the Stalin era, that Ukraine has no right to exist. All the movements that asserted that right are Nazi, fascistic, reactionary in their content, produced by foreign powers with the intention of undermining Russia. And therefore, to produce a text that gives from within Ukraine precisely those voices that show that there is a progressive history in Ukraine, there is progressive movements in Ukraine, there are free trade unions who can voice their opinions, there is a left in Ukraine despite the appalling heritage and legacy of Stalinism and crimes committed in the name of socialism against Ukrainians. But that is why this book is crucial. And the second aspect of the book is also, as it says, voices of solidarity. In addition to the voices of Ukraine, solidarity is crucial. Why? Because to sustain support for Ukraine requires a movement in support of Ukraine. Part of the reason that the Western democracies have given assistance to Ukraine is the fact that there is popular support for the Ukrainian cause. And even those who argue there's fatigue and attempt to exploit the cost of living crisis to undermine that support, the proof is that the support continues to be there, and the overwhelming majority support the provision of military aid to Ukraine and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. That voice has to be heard, and that was the other aspect of this book. This book also sets out the reasons why we need to support Ukraine. I'll begin by two, with the legitimacy of the book. The first section of this book is on the history. The history of Ukraine is a history of oppression, and the history of the people to fight that oppression. Ukraine is a historically oppressed nation. This might be the first war between states in Europe since 1945, but this is not a war between equal states in Europe. Ukraine is historically oppressed, and one of its primary oppressors, Russia and Russian imperialism, seeking to reconquer that territory that broke free from the empire. Russia, for 250 years, imposed colonial rule in Ukraine, subjected it to economic and national oppression, exploitation, and Russifying policies. That continued in the USSR under different forms, but for a brief period. Millions lost their lives at the hands of the Kremlin and the rival power Germany in Ukraine. So the national consciousness of Ukrainians, that deeply rooted longing for greater freedom and independence, hasn't something that's been manufactured. It's something with deep historical roots. And from those roots, Ukrainians have a right to claim a legitimacy to fight for national liberation and to defend the independence they democratically voted for in 1991 in majorities in every oblast and every province of Ukraine, including those areas that are occupied since 2014. Therefore, it's legitimate Ukrainians are fighting today to reunite their country in its entirety and to decolonize the country and overturn the legacy of empire. The second reason is that we live in a world today, like the 30s, with growing and creeping authoritarianism. And the front line of that struggle is in Ukraine against Putin's Russia. There is a link between the Trumpists, Bolsonaro, and the politics of the fascists in Europe and the regime that is increasingly become more and more authoritarian in Russia. Russia can combine its modern authoritarianism with a legacy of empire, and it's unleashed a war with a war of aggression in Ukraine, which reflects that authoritarianism and that legacy of empire, with the racist ideology that they have equipped their armies with. And that is evidenced in the war crimes which have been committed from day one that the Russian army had set foot in Ukrainian territory. This didn't just arise from that frustration of military forces who were unable to advance as rapidly as they desired. They began killing Ukrainians indiscriminately the minute they arrived, and they continue to kill Ukrainians. Thousands of war crimes have been recorded in Ukraine, and Ukrainians should have justice for those crimes, just as we saw in Nuremberg after World War II. And we've seen it in the destruction of Mariupol, 25,000 dead in what was a thriving city. We've seen it in the massacres in Bucha, Irpin and Bordianka. We've seen it in every area that's been liberated. In Kharkiv, in Kherson, liberation is followed by the revelation of mass graves and a reign of terror. That makes the argument, which is dealt with very well eloquently in this book, the argument that Ukraine should trade land for peace, or enter into peace deals with Putin, who wants no peace, or fake calls for ceasefires that are not happening. That makes those arguments, in my view, reactionary. Because what that would entail is that the Ukrainian government could consign sections of its population to a regime they know is engaged in mass murder, and that they would remain under a regime engaged in mass murder. Furthermore, the argument which we deal with in this book that we should stop aid to Ukraine, the aid to Ukraine is fueling the war. That also is a reactionary myth. To stop the military aid to Ukraine would not end the war. Ukrainians will continue to fight no matter whether aid arrives from the West or not. They had no assurance of support when Russia invaded. They were told by Biden and by Germany to evacuate the capital. The Russians could take it in 2 days. But they fought. And without the aid, they would continue to fight, and it would still be a long and protracted war. The aid, the military aid that is being supplied inadequately, in my view, is a necessity to get peace in Ukraine, because only with the military aid can liberation be achieved. Those who argue that we should stop this aid are doing so disingenuously and dishonestly. For what they actually mean is they want the victory of Russia. But that is exactly what that would mean. Secondly, those who are seeking to exploit the cost of living crisis, which is touched on in the book when it came out, are seeking to do so, in my view, from the most nationalist and to say quite racist arguments. The aid to foreign peoples, aid to other countries should come secondary to the needs of people in this country. The idea that wages for British workers should be counterposed to the very survival of Ukraine and stopping authoritarians, to me, in my view, is an obscene argument, and it should have no place in any progressive movement, never mind or labour movement. That argument, I think, we need to counter, and that's why we need to sustain a solidarity movement, is equipped with the type of arguments we have in here. I want to quote from the book. Book launches is often that you should do so, but I particularly want to quote from friend Taras Belets. Taras is not a nationalist at all. He's a socialist, a member of Socialny Ruch, the social movement in Ukraine. Sorry. Oh, sorry, page 55. Bit of a lesson, I'm afraid, but and is in the Territorial Defence Force. And he said, this is in reference to problems we've had with those I'm referring to who's called to stop aid or support for Ukraine. But he said, I'm writing from Ukraine where I served in the Territorial Defence Forces. A year ago, I couldn't have expected to be in this situation. Like millions of Ukrainians, my life has been upturned by the case of war. We often criticise the actions of the Ukrainian government and the way defence is organised, but they do not question the necessity of resistance and understand well why and for what we are fighting. At the same time, during these months, I've tried to follow and participate in discussions of the international left about the Russian-Ukrainian war. The main thing that I now feel from these discussions is fatigue and disappointment. Too much time being forced to debate obviously false Russian propaganda. Too much time explaining why Moscow had no legitimate security concerns to justify war. Too much time asserting the basic premises of self-determination that any leftist should already agree with. Perhaps most striking about many of these debates about the Russian-Ukrainian war is the ignoring of the opinions of Ukrainians. Ukrainians are still often presented in some left-wing discussion either as passive victims who should be sympathised with or as Nazis who should be condemned. But the far right makes up a clear minority of the Ukrainian resistance, while the absolute majority of Ukrainians support the resistance and do not want to be just passive victims. Now, Taras makes a contrast to the Vietnam War, which in some ways has become many myths and glorified in the movement, perhaps the golden age. And he points out that in the Vietnam War, that the Vietnamese resistance were receiving vast sums of aid from the USSR. The USSR, of course, was busy invading Czechoslovakia at the time and suppressing the Prague Spring. But no one said that that aid should be stopped, or that the Vietnamese national liberation struggle should not be supported because they were receiving armed aid from a totalitarian regime. And of course, sadly, on some years, that contrast in the arguments of Taras are deaf. But I would hope that people with more open minds can receive the arguments of Taras in this book. I want to conclude by saying, whilst these people need to be rebuffed and their arguments challenged, I think after a year of war, there's a degree in which we now need to move beyond simply setting out the legitimate right of Ukrainians to defend themselves from a genocidal invader. I think that we need to move to a point where we need to be advocating not the right to self-defence, but the need for the weapons to carry out that defence and liberation. It's my view quite strongly that the support for Ukraine from the Western democracies has been entirely inadequate. And there's a danger that we repeat the errors of the 1930s by failing to provide the necessary means and equipment to resist the authoritarians. And there's a danger of a repeat of the fall of the Spanish Republic if it's not done. That's why I think there needs to be far more greater advocacy, that these governments need to provide far greater military assistance. Today, there was a conference in London of the so-called Stop the War movement, where it was said that sending tanks from Germany to Ukraine would be like comparable to the Nazis and the provision of Nazi tanks rolling back in Ukraine. Utter absurdity. My view is that socialists and trade unions in Germany should be campaigning as militantly as possible for the provision of as many Leopard tanks as possible to be sent from Germany to the Ukrainian army. Those tanks will be driven by Ukrainians to fight a far-right regime that's invaded their country. An invasion which many in Ukraine do compare to the Nazi invasion of the Second World War. Indeed, I remember one woman who had survived the Second World War saying she hadn't experienced like it since the Nazis came. The only difference was this time she understood the language that they were speaking. So those are arguing that this is comparable to that are perverse in reaction in the conclusions. Similarly to this government has wrapped itself in the Ukrainian flag, the British government, and proclaimed itself to be the greatest friend of Ukraine. Certainly they have provided aid, and certainly it's been welcomed, but it's certainly far, far less than could be provided. With our campaign, we've shown that significantly far greater amounts of weaponry could be provided. From Challenger tanks to Warrior fighting vehicles, scimitars, Typhoon aircraft and artillery. I would conclude with this. You know, it was once said of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte turned the slogans of liberty, equality, fraternity into infantry, cavalry, and artillery. In my view, in this war, liberation does mean tanks, artillery, and aircraft, and they need them now.
It's certainly very difficult to add to such a cogent and impassioned speech. I think all of us are, in a small ways, feeling the impact of Russian invasion. Many of you sitting in coats. I'm without one, and I'm cold. That is one of the consequences. And I think certainly that is one of the consequences of the Russia's strategy to make all of us turn against the support for Ukraine that the governments in Europe are providing and across the Atlantic are providing to Ukraine, to create domestic pressures against the support for Ukraine. And to what Chris has said, I'd like to add that Russian victory, i.e. the consequence of stopping aid to Ukraine, Russian victory in this current moment would mean victory for imperialism and victory for colonialist oppression everywhere in the world. And certainly Russia, by invading Ukraine, is trying to struggle for a less American-dominated world, a more multipolar world, but it is a world that is infinitely worse than the world that is dominated by the US liberal empire. And I think in the current moment, I'm certainly, as a Ukrainian living in this country, I'm learning that the people and forces that I once considered my political enemies are becoming situational friends that we need to work with and to struggle to make them support Ukraine more. And those who are considered my friends on the left, many of them turned out to be my enemies. Because unfortunately, if the war has taught Ukrainians something, it is that the comfortable liberal distinctions where you can look, and debate the shades of ideas, can look into the nuance, where you could talk about big and small minorities and majorities in politics. All of that is obsolete because unfortunately, it is a matter of survival in the current war. Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion is a war of liberation. And I couldn't emphasize how important it is to go with what Ukrainians themselves want for the outcome that many Ukrainians themselves want to their struggle. Currently, about 3/4 of all Ukrainians want a return to the 1991 territorial borders of Ukraine, which is return of territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass. They reject, with 70% of Ukrainians reject any concession to Russia and reject any peace deal that would give Russia time to rearm and invade Ukraine again. Unfortunately, the so-called Stop the War coalition and others who are calling for peace are, even if they're driven, if they concede to them, even if they're driven by the best of intentions, the political outcome of their program means defeat of Ukraine and victory of Russia. The best way to end the war in Ukraine is to support Ukraine's victory. And the best way to do that is to pressure this government and other governments everywhere else to increase the pace of military supplies to Ukraine. This is something that I think for many socialists comes very hard to argue for weapons. But one thing that I think decades of being out of power have made us all forget, it is that sometimes you have to struggle for your good deeds and for your good cause, and sometimes that struggle has to be armed because there is no other way. And Chris has spoken very nicely, very well about the various arguments for solidarity and for supporting the Ukrainian resistance. I would like to end with one thing, and that is what concrete things we can all do to support Ukraine and support the people of Ukraine. Certainly, one of the things that the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign has been doing, been trying to coordinate direct aid and donations to the various movements such as Socialny Ruch, the social movement, which is a new left socialist movement, or to Ukrainian trade unions, because so many working men and women are fighting right now and are being supported by their trade unions, which tells you everything you need to know about socialist politics in Ukraine right now, I think, and where to stand and which side to support. But more importantly, and recognizing that we can never match the support that governments can provide, we need to pressure this government, and perhaps more importantly, this opposition, including the SNP, to be more forthright about quick, plentiful provision of aid to Ukraine, including infantry fighting vehicles, armor, and tanks. And this is important. I mean, you might say that, yes, Britain and other countries have provided a lot so far to Ukraine, and it might be arrogant to ask for more. But this is a question of time, in the sense that Ukraine, by not having these vehicles and these capabilities, is losing time. by losing time. It's given time to Russia to build up kilometers, hundreds of kilometers of trenches and of fortifications in Zaporizhia, on the left bank of Dnipro, in Kherson Oblast, in Donbass. And the sooner Ukraine is able to be armed and to push back, the better for everyone. The best way to end the war is to end it with a Ukrainian victory.
Ask people questions to show, and you like to start with a question or a contribution. Let's go first.
Please come forward because there's an online translation of the event.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you both very, very much indeed for such amazing. I'm lost in the words. I mean, complete and utter solidarity, and I completely agree with everything you say about the necessity for getting arms to Ukraine right away. I hope it's okay, but I've got a practical question. I'm trying to get a motion drafted from my union branch. I'm in Unite, and I'll be getting advice from people on the left. And one person said to me, "You've got to say something about NATO, and particularly you should say that Britain should withdraw from NATO." Now, I really would, I'm probably all over the place with this, but my instinct is still to leave any reference to NATO out of it. I completely agree that, as a person of Britain, NATO is not their friend. NATO is an imperialist power, and I totally agree that Britain should withdraw from NATO. But I don't really think that would be the top priority for Ukrainians at the moment. And in terms of getting a motion passed at my union branch, I kind of think, if I say, well, look, I think this branch should call for Britain's immediate withdrawal from NATO, they're just going to burst out laughing. I don't know. So am I right if I could just leave this out? And I just hope I wouldn't be accused of being, by anybody here, being soft in NATO, because I absolutely am not. But I say, I would really value your advice. Certainly when it comes to arming Ukraine, absolutely, and that's what I mean. I totally support the right of Ukrainians to get arms from anybody they can, including NATO, and I certainly think that as Britons in NATO, we should be giving them more arms. What I'm saying is, like, I'm sort of being accused of being not critical enough. Anyway, sorry.
I'll take a couple and then I'll ask some Harrison. Thank you very much, both the speakers. I mean, I'd echo what the Leslie said about supporting everything you've said. I've also got a very practical question. I've made 2 attempts to join Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, filling in the form. I've had no response whatever. Do you have any idea what's going on? No, I mean this is Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. This is not the Ukrainian army or the Ukrainian social movement. They put a form on the internet. I filled it in. They haven't responded.
Very easy and quick practical response there. You're a member as of now, and I take myself to power, and we'll take your contact and we'll put you in the chat.
Right, do that because right. I also have a contribution to make, but when you don't get back from an organisation, you can't really contribute to it. Listen,
I think I'm sorry, but I think I'm an artist and I've done the painting for the Ukraine sunflower. So on the back it says when the Ukraine sunflower seeds have been offered. I want to give most of the money from that to the Ukraine fund. I don't know how to go about it, but can I give you my contact details? It's a big painting and I make copies of it and I make cards for to sell to others. I don't know how to go about getting it done. Thank you. And welcome to Scotland.
Can I also say, declaration that anybody here today, we do have an Edinburgh and Scottish will be meeting on February the 1st online, hoping to organise, and anybody who gives their email address today will be told the Zoom details for that meeting. So Wednesday, February the 1st. So is any group in the age to do that. So just depend on joint. I mean, to me, I've relatively little contact other than Chris, but they all everything we've done, we've organised in Scotland. So that's, you know,
February the 8th, February the 8th, Alan.
February the 8th, my apologies, February the 8th.
Something else.
February the 8th, Wednesday, February the 8th. But if you want to, like, just give your email address to me or anybody else you think.
I was just wondering, to that, so we transferred the new part of the school by our response and the
I'll read it.
Yeah.
I'd like to get a quick question for that.
Right, okay. George.
Yeah, just a quick comment, if I may. I've read 2/3 of the book, you know, and which is a lot for me. So, Chris, it's a fantastic, you know, book. The John Paul article, with, you know, you get a history of Ukraine. You know, there's a fantastic. Is it Julia? Who's it? But there's interesting thing about the whole debate about reparations and funding. You know, once the war is over, hopefully sooner rather than later. You know, there needs to be like significant monies put into Ukraine so it can rebuild its its stuff in it. So it's a fantastic book, and generally also the Ukraine thing. You know, that actually it's Ukrainian people. It's not just pop-up professors who just happen to have read what's in the Morning Star that day. So solidarity, you know, and thanks for speaking.
Yeah, thanks. I was a bit nervous about coming today, I've been honest, because for nearly the last year, and I think this might be true for many people on the left. I'm currently in the Green Party, but I was in the Labour Party. I'm kind of experiencing a kind of feeling of cognitive dissonance, I think it's what it's called. Because I came into the Labour movement, and I've always been on the left through the peace movement, and I've always, you know, I've been on CND demos, and I've had banners bombed, jobs not bombed. I've marched with Stop the War people against the war against Iraq, which is why I left the Labour Party, and the hypocrisy of the West. And so now I find myself in a position where many of my comrades in arms, as it were, I've fallen out with a friend. I can't have him in the house, right? Because he just can't stop repeating all the stuff that he's got online. And when I've researched it, it's Putin. You know, it's just this. He's been on RT for the last year, and he was an expert in Ukraine, and I know why, because I've searched it. You know, and I didn't know as much as he did, but now I do. So what I'm saying is, on a personal level, this has been really refreshing for me, because I think it's really important for people on the left to recognise the justice of the argument that Ukraine should be supported in all ways, militarily as well as humanitarian. And for me, this has been and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. And I just say that as because I'm assuming most people here are probably on the left. And for me personally, the way that I have managed to deal with my cognitive dissonance is speaking to Ukrainian people. Actually, I've got Ukrainian friends who are still in Ukraine, and I know a lot of people who are now here, some people from Mariupol and Bucha and other places, and their views as well. So thank you for that, and I'm going to be brazen as well and advertise an event, if that's okay. I've just come from a meeting with Ukrainian people, and we're organising an event on the 23rd of February, which is the evening before the anniversary of the invasion. It's in the Scottish Storytelling Centre, and it's going to be Ukrainian people telling their traditional tales, singing their songs, cooking their food, and just being Ukrainian. Yeah, there is, yeah. So if anyone wants to come to that, that'd be great because it'll be our next audience. But I just want to say thank you very much and I look forward to reading the book.
Any other questions just now? It's just, I mean, okay, I'm going to abuse my own position as in the chair just now, because one of the things that is, if you were just approaching this from the left in Ukraine, you could understand concerns about Petlura, you could understand concerns about Bandera, you could understand concerns about the Azov Brigade. Every state has Britain has had it. If you think of the loyalists, the way they had all of these. But to hear from people who invoke these, people who support Putin or backwards Stalin, and say, well, wait a minute, what happened in the first 2 years of the Second World War? Stalin and Hitler were in alliance, occupied big chunks of territory, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, many killed by Stalin. Even members of the German Communist Party who had taken refuge in Russia were handed over to Hitler. So then you look at all the regimes where it says Putin is in power. You have to look at Transnistria, Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk, but most of all Chechnya. Look at the sort of regimes that are put in place. If Russia is bad, and I would say basically Russia is run by a form of traditional fascism that goes back to Tsarism. The main support was for far right fascism, but actually there have been elections of sorts, highly rigged elections, go to the places where, as like Transnistria or any of these other places, there are no elections in these places. Any form of independent trade unions, like go to Crimea, Crimean Tatars, who took a long time to win the right to come back to Crimea after Stalin deported them, having to leave again. So the sort of regime that would be imposed on any occupied territory in Ukraine would be more horrific than the Putin regime in Moscow itself.
I think first to Leslie's question about whether or not to include a motion on NATO in the motion on Ukraine, I would hope that members of your union, of your branch of the union, would understand that to support Ukraine is not for them to play their own identity politics around NATO. Yet they can oppose, or support NATO, whatever they want, but it is not the same thing as, and kind of express solidarity with Ukraine should not become a vehicle for other kinds of issues and the struggles inside the union. I understand the legitimate concerns about sort of imperialism and that sort of stuff, but I think we're in agreement here, right? I hope they will recognize that it is important to support Ukraine and struggle with Ukrainian people on their own terms, wherever the support comes from, because if someone does not have the experience of trying to survive under the bombs and under the bullets and fighting for their own independence, perhaps they shouldn't take upon themselves to tell people who do have that experience how to best to survive and how best to fight. And perhaps they should take in what the people who are fighting for their independence in their lives and treat it with respect, and take in what those people themselves say about what is the best way to fight. Now, I don't want to turn this into a poetry evening, but I think this is quite interesting that this is a Russian language poet from Kyiv, Russian language speaking poet from Kyiv. This is a trilingual book. It has a Ukrainian translation of the Russian language poem. The poems are quite funny, sarcastic poems. And this specific one, and it's an English translation. The specific one is written in the voice of a Russian soldier. And the last several lines go like this. Is it hard for you, says the soldier to a Ukrainian, is it hard for you to understand world order and the proper order of the earth? We kill you with brotherly love, and they kill you with European friendship. And I think that goes to the heart of some of the cultural struggles and identity struggles that Ukrainians have had to put up with at the same time as they have had to fight soldiers like these. This war is existential, not just in the sense of physical survival. It is existential in the sense of cultural determination, cultural survival as well. Because at the core and the root of it, as much as some people would like to deny the ideological roots of this war, people deny the ideological roots of Holocaust and of the Second World War for Germany. As much as there are people like that, even among Ukrainian socialists, and we know some of them, the root of at the root of the war is a denial of Ukraine's right to exist and to determine itself as a nation. And I think sometimes it's captured rather well in poetry, even if it's not the best poetry, but still. And last thing I'll say, thanks. The last thing I'll say is a couple of questions on practical support. One thing that I wish I'd said was that I think the Scottish government and the Parliament ought to hear voices like this, and your voices if you support our cause. I think there should be an evidence hearing commission, or at least some kind of caucus inside the Parliament and with the Scottish government on how Scotland should best support Ukrainians in Scotland. And the Scottish government ought to support progressive voices that are calling for a demonstration on the anniversary of the invasion on the 24th, on Saturday, the 25th of February. So if you do have a spare moment, write to your MSP.
Good stuff. So we say something about the campaign. I'm very sorry we get membership coming through on that app, so I don't know why yours hasn't. I'm sure you've not been purged. Sure. And for the campaign, what are our priorities? We decided priorities this year ahead. The first one is the campaign for weapons. The other is direct aid, and we're responding to requests for aid. We have a vehicle going to for soldiers in Pavlograd this month. We're preparing another vehicle which will go into the Donetsk region of the Confederation of Free Trade Unions, and it will be for their members who are fighting in Bakhmut. And it's direct aid, but it also illustrates, it is quite a tragic situation where people who are fighting a nuclear superpower are having to crowdfund to sustain the military resistance. Direct aid, and those links with the trade unions and their trade unions who are fighting, trade unions at the front, and being supported by the trade union headquarters, the links with us. That's one of our priorities. Other priority is the issue of the justice for the war crimes, and we'll continue to campaign on that. We want an international tribunal, whatever form it takes, to ensure that there's justice for the crimes that have been committed in the course of this invasion. So we've set a number of priorities there around, and the final one is reconstruction. And that is not a long-term aim, that is immediate too, because we want socially progressive reconstruction that is ensures that civil society and trade unions are fully participating, and that reconstruction isn't, as is happening, simply prizing open the Ukrainian economy for global capital to plunder it. And Ukraine needs reconstruction, and there are now trillions of dollars of damage been done to that economy by the Russian invasion from 2014 to date. In terms of where we go from here, this year is going to be decisive. The Russians are rebuilding their army. They're looking towards a second mobilization of the troops. They're not gone, as Taras has set out. They're entrenching in preparation for Ukraine's spring offensive. And we have to do our utmost to ensure that the balance is shifted this spring and summer to liberate the rest of Ukraine. And that is possible. Russia has been defeated at every turn in this war, and the strategic goals have been set back. First, they wanted to take Kiev, and they failed. They wanted to take Kharkiv, and they failed. They held fake ballots in Kherson and they failed. Yeah, they said they would take all of Donbass and Luhansk and they failed. So Ukraine has proven that I've argued that people empowered by the idea of freedom can defeat the strongest armies in the world. So they now need our help to finish the job this year, and that is to send the Russians back to Rostov and out of Crimea. And I think that's possible. And in doing that, I just want to finish on this point about we are having to change in a way. And I hear your point that many of us have never been people who have been militaristic and advocate war. And it feels as if it's not in our tradition. I think actually there's a degree in here which we need a more historical approach to that, Rick. Actually, that's not the case. Our tradition is different. We have posed some wars. The First World War was a reactionary war of empires. But to take the position we had in that war and then make it an absolute applicable to every situation is wrong. And that's what's happening with pseudo arguments against it. Historically, our movement, the social and democratic movements, progressive change in society, have supported wars. The Chartist movement in this country supported arms for Poland repeatedly to free themselves from Russian occupation. We supported the United States of America against the Confederacy. Karl Marx himself wrote repeatedly articles for waging total war on the Confederates in the New York Tribune. And they supported the Spanish Republic against the fascists, against the intervention of Germany and fascist Italy. And many socialists, although some people are controversial, I support the Second World War as a progressive war against the Nazis. And many socialists called on the government to send aid to the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, and they were right. And this reminds ourselves what the Communist Party were saying at that time, who are now the biggest supporters of Putin and the Stop the War Coalition. But this reminds us, they were campaigning from 1939 to 1941 against arms being delivered to this country when the Luftwaffe were bombing it, saying that it would inflame the situation and exacerbate the war. They were calling for peace with Hitler. Yeah. That's what we have today, these latter-day appeasers. So it isn't alien from our tradition in progressive circumstances to support aid for the oppressed to resist the oppressors. Because unfortunately, we don't have a state. We don't have a progressive country that can deliver aid for us. All we have is what we have before us. Bourgeois liberal democracies. But I'd rather have that than a gulag of the heel of Putin.
Would you mind speaking to because there's people on the online.
So I've been protesting and organising for Ukraine since last February. I spoke outside the Russian consulate in Edinburgh on February 25th. One of the things that changed around October was the use of loitering munitions by Russia against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. They had attacked this before, but it was much more limited. One of the things that could happen now is that Ukraine could take back every inch of territory. They could reach the Sea of Azov, cut off the Crimean bridge, and then take Kherson and Crimea because the Russians simply wouldn't have supply. They could fight a grueling war in Donbass, take back every inch of land there with the weapons that they have now. But the Russians have demonstrated that they'll get these weapons from Iran and they'll just keep sending them. And I think the solution, if that happens, is for Ukraine to invade Rostov. You might laugh, but the reality is there will be no other leverage. Russia wants to destroy Ukraine. But if that scenario happens, what are your thoughts? What should we do? What should the Ukrainians do?
I don't think it's necessary because I think that the Russian army is defeated in Ukraine. They're driven out of Crimea. Well, they won't have the Black Sea Fleet to fire cruise missiles from it or the drones from Crimea anymore. the situation in Russia will go into crisis if that army is defeated. Absolutely. There was a revolution after the defeat of the 1905. The 1917 revolution was sparked by the defeat in Afghanistan, helped generate bring down that regime. So it's entirely possible that it will generate change. We don't know the outcome. We can't predetermine it. Will they continue to fire the missiles? Possibly. In a position of defeat, they might. I think probably not. But of course, what's the safeguard against that is strengthening the missile defense system in Ukraine and fortifying the country to prevent that. But is there a need to invade Rostov and invade Russia? I think that would be insane. The army would be defeated. There would be a chance either they've got a ceasefire or a peace deal, and I think it would generate change. But that would be completely given to Putin what he wants. To portray this as a war of aggression against Russia and a war of the West against Russia, when it's a war of liberation of Ukraine. In its entire history, Ukraine has never attacked Russian territory, and I don't see why it needs to do it now.
Sorry. I just want to pick up on where Chris left off just earlier on, because I think there are lots of examples of where we socialists would support war, but I think there's also lots of lessons we can learn from the past. And I suppose the first thing, because I want to say this first, because I think it is actually the most important thing at the moment, is we've got a really big job to do to build working class solidarity here with the working class and the people of Ukraine, because I think self-determination for Ukraine is not the dominant view on the left at the moment, I think, and we need to win that, and we need to win it among much wider layers of people. But I also think, and I think it is possible to do kind of argue more than one thing at once, that we have to also be very clear that the NATO ruling classes of the what Chris referred to as the Western democracies, although I would kind of put inverted commas around that, I think, because these are countries which have also been responsible for horrific war crimes. It's one of the things that has given Putin license, I think, in Chechnya, for example, was that he was just doing what the United States does. I mean, that's a fact. And these people are not our friends, and they're not friends of the Ukrainian people either. And I think there are two, I mean, there are many, I don't want to go on, but I think there are two situations which they would hate. They would hate, for example, for Putin to be overthrown from below. That would set a very bad example, which they would not want in any shape or form. What they would actually be quite happy with, though, is some kind of redrawing of borders, because actually you can imagine a hostile border across some part of Ukraine would essentially engender a situation of continual conflict. It wouldn't be a solution, but it would actually be a living nightmare for people in Ukraine, I think, and elsewhere. People who would love it would be the arms industries worldwide, because that would ensure that rather than this war ending, it would actually continue in all kinds of ways for some future period. So I think we do have a responsibility to make sure that the working class movement for solidarity with Ukraine is actually very sharply differentiates itself from the interests of our movements.
Which is quite the last book that we'll be able to shortly up the rate.
Very quick, I'm Mike, Ukraine Solidarity Campaign involved in some years. Just to say that there is an international appeal. People talked about linking up. We have a Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in this country, but And there is also an international network in support of Ukraine in Europe that's formed of progressive social trade union-based organisations to give solidarity. And they've issued an appeal for turning February the 24th, the anniversary of the invasion, into a global week of action against the Russian Russian invasion, and for solidarity with Ukraine, and to have progressive movements around Europe supporting that. If anyone holds a position, I haven't passed the list round. I hope everybody's signed the list who wants to keep involved in the Ukraine Solidarity campaign. You can join us on February the 8th when the next online meeting will be. But if anyone holds any positions or is interested in signing this international here, I have a copy of it here. Secondly, just a sort of a plug. I came into the movement as a chess player. People may know, the last 100 years, the world of chess has been dominated by the Soviet Union in the first instance, and by other chess movements. And it's the largest participatory activity in the whole of the former Soviet Union, including Russia and Ukraine. And Russia has dominated the International Chess Federation and was due to hold the World Chess event. Unfortunately, the chess community stood up against it. One of the things that they've done, which I think is symbolic in the sense of the whole question of voices, is that they've created a book, they produce very rapidly. Does anyone is a chess player? And the idea of this is it's a biography of major world chess players, world standard chess players, and it's details of the Ukrainian chess movement and why it's important. It has, yes, you're not to look. Oh, sorry, Karyakin is going for Russia. Yeah. Yeah, sure. So you can buy this book from an organisation called New in Chess, but I just mentioned that. And lastly, we're in Edinburgh. This was quite right to talk about the reference points that we have, particularly for those of us who are in the socialist movement. And one of the most important reference points is James Connolly. James Connolly was born a few hundred yards towards the centre of Edinburgh, and is a major reference point for thousands and millions of socialists and anti-imperialist activists around the world. He went to Ireland, as people know, from Edinburgh, and he led the uprising in 1916. In something like 1913, 1914, Connolly took over the organisation of the Irish Citizens Army, which was a trade union defence organisation formed to stop picket lines by trade unionists being attacked by the armed forces of the state. They were also extremely worried when the Ulster Volunteer Force were delivered 20,000 rifles, and the entire Irish independence movement was horrified at this. Padre Pierce said the only thing that's more ridiculous than an Orangeman with a rifle is a nationalist without one. And the Irish nationalists, including the socialists amongst them, led by Connolly, arranged to get guns, the so-called House Mauser. House Mauser was delivered at a place called Howth near Dublin. It was an antique. It was obsolete, first built in the 1870s, but it was a rifle. And the Irish Citizens Army of Connolly, to defend the workers that were being attacked, and eventually to support the uprising that took place in Dublin. There was also an uprising against the imperialist war that was then being waged, and against British occupation of Ireland, was led by people who had these Mausers that had been purchased and delivered through German. And in fact, they actually hoped for a lot more. But there's another significant lesson in this, which is that, unfortunately, Connolly and the forces of the uprising were defeated. And one of the reasons they were defeated was because the British had artillery. They had grenades, they had explosives. And the poor old Irish Republicans only had the House Mauser. And suddenly they were defeated. Had they had artillery, had they had weapons, which they would have taken from anybody, including German imperialism, the world might, and particularly the state of Ireland, might be in a different situation. And of course, socialists around the world applaud Connolly. Lenin described him as one of the biggest heroes. He changed Lenin's view about the whole question of nationalism and colonialism, something that a lot of people forget. And I think it should be remembered that that's a really important reference point for us in why we should be supporting armed resistance by Ukraine and supporting their right to get weapons, whether it's from German imperialism, as Connolly did, or from British imperialism, as the Ukrainians are getting. It doesn't matter. It's the purpose that they're being used for that is the important thing.
That does bring us to any last words you'd like to say? What's that, right? First of all, if you would like to join the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in Scotland, make sure you give your email address or address or phone number there. Please do that. And next meeting is a Zoom meeting, and it's on February the 8th. Hoping to organise some event to coincide with the anniversary of the invasion. Lastly, after this, if you'd like to continue the discussion, we checked out the pubs on the other side of the road. Normally, in summer, we go to the Pear Tree, which is a lovely garden. I do not recommend being out in the garden there. The bar itself is too crowded. The one at 7 o'clock, 32 below, which is almost opposite, was the one that was least crowded. So we will be going into 32 below. So what I'd like to finish off, guys, very much is thanking our two speakers tonight for coming on, and also the audience as well for coming out on such a cold night. Thank you. Bye.